Final Fantasy XIV is a game that we have all come to know and love over the many years that it's been out. For some people, they love the story. For some people, it's the flexibility on the many jobs that you can play on one character. And for others, it's just, hanging around in Limsa and doing things that are definitely not questionable. Ultimately, though, the game has a lot to offer. There are many reasons as to why we adore this MMO, but there also are a few things that Eorzea just makes us kind of sit back, sigh, and just kind of groan about, if I'm honest. So that's why in today's video, I want to count down the top 5 things that personally for me, I really have grown to dislike in Final Fantasy XIV. And, before anyone says it, I do love the game. This is all just for a little bit of fun, but hey ho, let's get started. Up first at number 5 has got to be the slow burning main story quest, and this truthfully will relate to the social aspect of the game too, and you'll see why shortly. What I've always found really funny with Final Fantasy XIV is when you're trying to explain the game or trying to get people from the outside interested to come into the circle of 14, you end up saying things like, oh, just get through the story, it really picks up later on, or just put 100 hours in and, the game really fleshes out, just get to Heaven's Ward and it really does get better. And that is truthfully half the issue. The game does get a lot better, and in my opinion, A Realm Reborn is also very good. I feel like it just gets a lot of hate where it's not necessarily warranted, but there is absolutely truth in that statement. The game does get better, just much, much later. I would argue that depending on who you are and depending on your pacing, you would probably need to put in at least a minimum of 200 to 300 hours of story dedicated time alone to get to the most recent and relevant content. And if I'm being honest, that's probably on the basis that you're skimming over a lot of things and not really deep diving the content. Some of my main frustration with the MSQ comes from the early stuff. As much as I've said A Realm Reborn is fine, it doesn't really deserve the hate it gets, which is true. There is no denying it is a little bit of a slog. Most of the quests are just go to this person, speak to this person, hand this in, take this there, and guess what? You've just unlocked yourself a new quest to go and speak to someone else. The pacing just feels a little bit off. I feel like if you're a veteran player of 14, you'll say things like, oh, well, it's just important for the world building, soaking in the story, and well, yes, that's true, but to a Sprout, to someone who's brand new to the game, they're not really going to care so much straight away. They just kind of want to, play with you. You've invited them into the game. Why can they not play with you? It's kind of like being invited to someone's house for dinner and then you're just forced to sit on the sofa and watch them eat. It just kind of doesn't really make sense and it's a little bit weird. But yeah, going back to the social side of things, even if your friends do decide to come and join you in 14 and come and hang out, that's pretty much all you can do until they've cleared certain MSQ milestones, done certain dungeons, trials, that sort of thing. They can't really do a great deal other than maybe RP with you in Limsa. There's not really a great deal for them to do other than just watch you go off and sail off into the sunset and do all the cool stuff. So yeah, the reality is for the first 300 hours, essentially your experience is basically just a solo RPG, occasionally walking past your friends as they're going off to do whatever they want to do. It's not necessarily the greatest segue into a game that, you've been told so many great things about. On to number 4 now, we've got to talk about the empty open world. Now, let's be honest, the open world in Final Fantasy XIV is gorgeous. The art direction is stunning, the music is just incredible, and the sense of wonder, it kind of stops when you realize that there's almost nothing that will really jump out to you and surprise you. The set pieces are amazing. What they've done with the game in terms of its direction is wonderful, but there's nothing really out in the open world that really urges you to take that next step, to look past the waterfall, to enter into the cave, to try and seek something else. Exploration in this game mostly boils down to just sightseeing. You're not really going to stumble onto a secret boss in the corner of a map outside of elite enemies. Nothing that's going to go crazy and wipe your party unless you're directly part of a hunt train hunting down, some of the toughest enemies in the game. Because the game does a very good job of introducing you to the many instances and dungeons, it's not as if you're going to just find one hidden just out in the wayside, tucked behind waterfalls like we mentioned before. And as for the enemies that are wandering around the map, they do feel to some extent slightly decorative at times. As I mentioned, you have got some stronger elite enemies and you've got the real sort of S tier hunts that you can go for, which require quite a lot of people to take down. But outside of that, the general mobs, they are just really kind of an inconvenience to even fight. I would actually argue that you could probably run through most of the zones completely naked and you'll be absolutely fine. There is no real challenge there, if I'm honest. Speaking of challenge, even the open world fates, they aren't really the most trying things. These are essentially the game's version of open world events, and they're more like minor inconveniences to kind of overcome for experience and currency. Personally, for me, I only ever really do these and gravitate towards Fates if I'm really struggling with stuff to do in my downtime. Otherwise, I tend to just veer off and do other things instead. The reality is, though, with the open world, once you've unlocked flying in most of your zones, that gorgeous landscape you've spent all this time admiring, you'll just be kind of hovering over and just speeding past like it's nothing. I always think to myself, how amazing would it be if all of these areas in some way, shape or form had like hidden puzzles or secret walls in the form of like, you know, like Dark Souls games, you used to hit a wall and you'd be able to traverse through and find different puzzles and things going on, or hidden dangerous mobs that only spawn at certain times, or things get more difficult when it's nighttime. I know you've got to kind of account for everyone and not everyone's super hardcore and wants the same things, but I do feel like it'd be cool to just spice it up a little. Now, number 3 on the list is something that's getting on a lot of people's nerves right now, and that's the fact that the game is technically massively multiplayer, but if I'm honest, it feels mostly single player. Final Fantasy XIV is listed as an MMORPG, and it does have a lot of MMO components, but if I'm being real with you guys, these days, it's starting to feel more like a single-player RPG every single time I log in. With the introduction of trusts and duty supports, you can pretty much run now almost every dungeon and trial just with NPCs instead of real people, and actually for the added story benefit and the lore that you get from the dungeons through doing the trusts, it's actually better to do it that way for the first time anyway. Now, because there isn't a great reason to go back into a lot of these normal instances outside of doing them for the first time, unless they go into a roulette, this does mean that you're, essentially funneling a lot of the player base into a single player experience, because they're unlikely to want to queue for that with a bunch of random people when they've already done it and got more out of it in the trust system than they would have done with a public party who, may or may not have waited for them to watch cutscenes, because I guess that's a reality. Not everyone is kind enough to wait for people to view their cutscenes. Of course, I do want to state here that the trust and duty support system is amazing if you are, socially awkward, you struggle in certain situations, or maybe you just don't want to run the risk of messing up in front of people. But, you can find yourself, if you are that sort of person, not really getting involved in any group content for days, maybe even weeks. At this stage, you can do the MSQ alone, you can craft alone, you can gather alone, fish alone, do pretty much a majority of anything in the game alone. And, so if you hear people referencing online that Final Fantasy XIV is technically a single-player RPG, well, now you'll know what we're referring to. Again, don't get me wrong, this is great for people who just want to play through the story at their own pace, but it also means that you can join an MMO and somehow never actually interact with other players unless you really, really go out of your way. Which is such a shame, because I feel like social interaction in MMOs is so important, and they can breed some of the best moments in gaming, certainly from ones that I've had from the likes of WoW Classic, where the fundamentals of the game are pretty much just built around socialization. On to topic number 2 now, and for me that has got to be the facade that you can play any job. Now, I want to preface this by saying that yes, you can play any job. However, if you do want to introduce yourself into any form of high-end content, Savage and above, you absolutely cannot just play any job. The best in slot grind for this game does not benefit anyone that is trying to play multiple jobs. Essentially, the moment that you hit max level on your job, you ultimately get to start the thrilling process of chasing best in slot gear. And by thrilling, I do mean that really it can be quite soul destroying sometimes. Now, a lot of the pre-raid gear that you're going to need to take on the higher content will come from currency turn-ins, and the currency that you'll get comes from doing your roulettes, which are basically hard cut off every week. You can only earn a certain maximum per week. What this does mean is that you're going to want to be very, very selective about the few jobs that you decide to main and make sure they fall under the same sort of housing, whether it be range DPS, physical DPS, that sort of thing. The reason for this is because the grind itself is already quite large with the currency cutoff that you've got per week. So if you can imagine, if you were trying to find best in slot gear for like a Dragoon and a Black Mage, for example, that is going to take you a lot longer because they're in 2 totally different subsets of gearing. Now, whilst if you did grind long enough, you could probably get best in slot for everything, but it wouldn't remain best in slot forever, because with every new patch and major updates, that best in slot, that item level gets increased every time, and thus the journey continues. So essentially, yes, you can play every single job, but in the highest form of content, the most difficult content in the game, you are definitely better off focusing on 1 or 2 particular jobs and getting the most gear, the highest item level for those 2 jobs, and really learning your rotations, because that's another thing. You can play a lot of jobs, but you may not be able to play them very well. It's better to focus on a couple that you really enjoy, nail down your rotations, get your best in slot gear, and get the most out of 14. Last on the list of things that I personally really don't like so much in 14 has to be the PvP. Now with 14's PvP, some people love it, some people hate it, and some log in, try it once, and never touch it again. And if I'm being real, it's a weird one. PvP. It's kind of there. It feels a bit like an afterthought in the game. The game really wasn't designed around PvP, and it shows. In PvP, the whole identity of your job is kind of condensed down into this like Diet Coke version of your job, and it just kind of feels a bit odd to use. A lot of the job actions are built into one button. A lot of your attacks are really dependent on the server tick rate. Some things land, some things don't. Sometimes you get stunned, sometimes you don't. And really a lot of the fights, if you're one-on-one, for example, I've had fights that have gone on for about 3 minutes, no joke, with just one person, because, you know, you're just absolutely smacking the living daylights out of each other. And really, because you can heal so freely and build up your shield so easily, it kind of just, after a while, you kind of just have a mutual decision to just walk away from it. You know, let's just not waste our time. And the only other alternative to that is that you are, you know, standing minding your own business, capturing a flag, the whole enemy team just absolutely bum rushes you, you get destroyed, or it's your team doing it to someone else. It just feels like such an odd concoction. With that being said though, I do enjoy the more condensed modes of PvP, which is Crystalline Conflict. I really do enjoy that kind of more intimate experience. But even so, with titles like WoW being the most obvious competitor out there, it does somewhat leave things to be desired. It's not quite as free-flowing and responsive as the likes of WoW, but in reality, I guess PvP is there for those that want it, and it does house some pretty cool cosmetic rewards and currency rewards too. So there you guys have it, just a few things that I personally have come to dislike over my time in Final Fantasy XIV. I would be quite keen to hear from you. What are your thoughts? What hasn't made the list that you would include? Leave them down below in the comments, like the video if you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.